In this video, we're going to talk about communities and how we assess biodiversity within communities, and then also how communities change over time through the process of ecological succession. So looking at this community again, this African Serengeti community, what we see are a bunch of species, but if we want to assess the diversity of this community, we've got to look at two things. The first thing we want to look at is species richness. That just means the number of different species that are in that community. Just count up the number of different plants and animals, and that's the richness, the species richness. But we also want to consider how abundant all the species are relative to each other. So relative abundance is a way where we actually look at how the species sort of relate to each other. Are they in equitable numbers, or is there one species that sort of distorts and dominates a community? So let's look at a couple examples of that. Species diversity is species richness plus species abundance. So again, now to the examples. So if we said this represents, maybe each animal on here represents 50 of that species, and we look at this community, what's the richness? Well, if we count up the total number of different species, we can see that there are 10 different species. Okay, so species richness is 10. Species diversity, though, you can see there's a lot of elephants, and there's not a lot of other species in terms of the relative numbers of each of those other species. There are 10 different species, but again, low numbers of all the other species except for the elephant. So we'd say the species diversity is low. Let's look at another community, and we can see here we've got the same species richness. We've got the same 10 species represented, but the diversity is much higher. We have more of an evenness of all of the species. And this is going to be sort of a much more high biodiversity that we'll see in this species. And in class, I'll actually give you guys a formula where we actually calculate species diversity. It's called the Simpson's Biodiversity Index, where we actually calculate species diversity in a way incorporating species richness and species evenness. So other things that can influence biodiversity, one thing is geographic size. So on the Galapagos Islands, they're represented in this picture down below. The biodiversity of the different islands actually is positively correlated to the size of the islands. And you can see this line, this best fit line, should look familiar. We did this when we looked at the lung correlation, right? And you can see that there's a pretty good correlation between the size of the island and the biodiversity. So the larger it is, the more different niches in there, the different micro habitats and microclimates are going to allow for more species to flourish. In a small island, it can have much lower species diversity. Okay. Other things that obviously affect species diversity, the greatest biodiversity is obviously down near the equator, the tropical rainforests, right? As we move towards the poles, species diversity decreases. So we see this biodiversity highest around the equators and then decreasing as we go towards the poles. And that has to do with about the amount of available energy in the areas, the amount of precipitation, and also what we call primary productivity. We haven't really got to ecosystems yet, but ecosystems, we actually measure how much energy they're able to capture from the sun. The more an ecosystem can capture from the sun, the more different species it's going to be able to support. The wider the number of niches will be supported in that area. So these two graphs, again, showing a positive correlation. This one on the left is plants, and this is showing evapotranspiration. So the more water that's lost through plants, the greater the species diversity. And with animals, we see, again, also sort of a positive relationship here, although it's leveling off as we get higher. But again, the hotter the temperature and the more rainfall, generally the more energy is available, the higher the primary productivity of that community, and the greater the biodiversity. And so now let's talk about ecological succession. So succession is just change over time within communities. And at some point in time, a community is going to start with primary succession. Primary is when you had no life existing there before. So you can think about like an volcano bubbling up out of the ocean and forming a solid piece of rock like Hawaii maybe many thousands of years ago. Or another good place to study primary succession is where you have glaciers, and when the glaciers recede. So you'd have ice over Glacier Bay for thousands of years, and now that ice is receding, and you've got ground up rock, pulverized rock, that's never really sustained life or hasn't for thousands of years. So what's going to happen in that area? Well, as soon as that rock is exposed, pioneer species will move in. And these are things like moss and lichen, things that can grow on bare rock, and they'll slowly produce some carbon dioxide and allow the rock to break down and build up small amounts of soil. And that'll allow for this succession for other plants to then move in. Once we build up a little bit of organic matter, other plants can then move in, and we see this process of succession occur. So what happens, and if you've ever been on the Alaska cruise, you actually go up Glacier Bay, and you're actually going up sort of and going back through succession. You're seeing the climax community when you first get in, and then as you approach the glacier, you're seeing the pioneer species. So it's kind of an interesting cruise to sort of observe succession in the bay. So first, what do we see? The moss and lichen build up soil, and we see small bushes and fast-growing trees like alders and cottonwoods growing up. They give way to larger trees like spruce and cottonwoods that are obviously getting taller. And then ultimately in the Pacific Northwest, we end up with a climax community, okay, which would be spruce and hemlock forest, right? If it was Louisiana, maybe we would have, the cypress would be sort of the climax species in and around our sort of bayou wetland communities. And that would sort of be sustained. It wouldn't last forever though. This idea that the climax is it and now we're done is really now kind of been rebuked, and we really have recognized the importance of disturbances. And actually what disturbances do is they recycle nutrients, they allow for new species to come in and sort of colonize, and we've now recognized this process of succession and the role of fire in kind of recycling and restarting this process over. So after we get a major disturbance like a fire or a volcano, here's Mount St. Helens, we see secondary succession. Secondary succession is reestablishing a community that's been destroyed by a natural disaster or a disturbance. So Mount St. Helens in about 1980 blew up, covered ash for miles around, but we saw very quickly that these pioneer species, what we might call R selected species, right? They're weedy, they get their seeds out there and they grow very quickly and they recolonize, and we see this process of succession begin again. So in this case, the pioneer species are weedy grasses and fast-growing plants that produce a lot of seeds that can get in there and take over because there's already soil existing. They don't have to sort of create the soil from bare rock. So this process of secondary succession is much faster. And again, we've now kind of rethinking this idea of wildfires and disturbances. We used to put out all fires and have this total sequester attitude about disturbances, and now we've realized that periodic fires actually are good for communities and actually increase biodiversity by creating sort of patchy areas where the forest gets broken up. You can see here this was a fire at Point Reyes, California, north of San Francisco, and after the year after, there was this explosion of wildflowers that hadn't been seen in this national park for many, many years, but because the fire kind of broke up this community of, this climax community of lodgepole pines, we now had greater biodiversity. So we've recognized the importance of these disturbances, again, in this succession and in actually increasing biodiversity. So that's it for communities.